After my husband died, my son secretly hired a lawyer to change the will, but he didn't predict this would happen. Have you ever stood in a room filled with your own family and felt like a ghost? I was sitting at the Thanksgiving table, my own butternut squash untouched, while my son smiled like a stranger and his wife whispered about me like I was some burden to be handled. They didn't know I had already found the real will. They didn't know Reuben had left behind more than just memories. He left a plan. That day, I realized something. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's just the sound of a woman sharpening her voice again. So, if you think this is just another story about an old widow fading quietly, think again. Subscribe and stay with me because in a world where the elderly are often pushed aside, some of us are finally learning how to push back. My name is Sylvette Winters, and I'm 79 years old. Until recently, I thought I was just a grieving wife living in a too-quiet cabin at the edge of Blue Ridge Glen, Pennsylvania. I'd spent most of my life believing that love meant giving until you had nothing left and then giving some more. But after my husband passed, something changed. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that someone was trying to erase me slowly, quietly with paperwork and polite smiles. This is the story of how I went from forgotten to unignorable, of how a cedar chest, a USB drive, and a 17-year-old girl pulled back the curtain on a truth that no one thought I'd ever see. So, if you've ever wondered what happens when a quiet woman stops being polite, keep listening, because sometimes the ones they count out are the ones who write the final chapter. The house was too quiet. After 48 years with Reuben, silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like punishment. I had always imagined grief would come crashing down, like a hurricane, like thunder at midnight. But no, it was more like frost creeping over a window pane. Steady and silent until everything you see is a little blurry, and you're not quite sure what's real anymore. The bed creaked when I sat up. Too much space on his side. I didn't bother fluffing the pillow anymore. It had flattened into the shape of his head, and maybe I wanted to keep it that way. I slid my feet into my old slippers, the ones with the felt bottoms nearly worn through, and shuffled toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked. They used to annoy him. Now they were just company. I clicked on the kettle and pulled open the cupboard. One tea bag left. Cinnamon. Reuben always liked the mint, saying cinnamon was too loud a flavor in the morning. I smiled to myself, then stopped. Smiling felt traitorous. As the water boiled, I looked out the window. The first snow had started falling sometime in the night. A thin dusting coated the railing on the porch and blanketed the roof of the old shed. I used to hate snow. Now, I wasn't sure what I felt about anything. On the kitchen table sat the stack of condolence cards, mostly from church folks or neighbors we hadn't seen in a decade. A few from Paul's college friends, typed and impersonal. And then there were the bills, stamped, robotic, cold. I turned on the radio. Gospel music came through just soft enough to keep the silence from swallowing me whole. He once told me, "No matter what happens, I've written everything down." I thought he meant his memoir. I thought he was being poetic. I took my tea to the fireplace and lit a match. The logs caught fast. Reuben always packed them too tight, but I'd loosen them the way I liked. The flame danced like it was doing a slow waltz. I let my eyes drift to the mantel where his photo still sat. Reuben in his fishing vest holding that ridiculous trout. I couldn't bring myself to move it. Around 9, I got dressed and made my way to the clinic. Bonnie greeted me the way she always did, with a little too much lipstick and a voice that sounded like she was perpetually on speakerphone. "Lord, you look tired, Sil," she said, handing me a clipboard, but still better than half the town. I gave her a nod, the kind you reserve for people who mean well but don't quite know what else to say. "Hardest part's the paperwork," she continued. "Always is, especially these days. Kids rush the wheels before the soils even settle." That made me pause. I didn't say anything, just watched her file charts and hummed to herself. She had a habit of making big truths sound like gossip. That line, it stuck. Back home, I made soup from a frozen bag and read through some of Reuben's old letters. He kept everything: grocery receipts, high school report cards, even a note I left on the fridge in 1993 that just said, "Milk's gone bad." "So, have you?" I laughed out loud at that one. I hadn't remembered writing it. The phone rang around 3 p.m. The kind of ring that startles you even though you've lived with it for decades. I picked it up already knowing it wasn't Paul. He only texted now. Sylvette. It's Chandler. Harold Chandler. His voice was older than I remembered, frail, like it had gone through a cheese grater. Oh, hello, Mr. Chandler. I hope you're keeping well. I'll cut to it. Something odd came across my desk today. I sat up straighter. There's been a request to transfer the cabin title. It came through another firm out in Harrisburg a couple of days ago. I stared at the wall. The fireplace cracked. Harrisburg? I asked. Yes. The name on the request listed Paul as primary and Constance. I assume that's your daughter-in-law? Yes, he paused, choosing his next words like they were glass. I was surprised because, well, the 2019 will, Ruben's last signed one, it's still active in our system. And as far as I know, you're the sole beneficiary of the cabin and savings. I didn't know what to say. I thanked him. I think maybe I just hung up. The tea had gone cold. I poured another cup, this time with no bag, just hot water. I didn't taste anything anyway. I walked into the den, passing the photo wall with all those frames. Paul's graduation, our 30th anniversary, that blurry picture of Callie on the swing. I stopped at Ruben's desk, the oak one with the drawer that stuck. I pulled it open. The same chaos it always had. Rubber bands, receipts, dried-out pens. But underneath the chaos was a small black notebook bound with a rubber band. His handwriting on the cover said, "Deposit boxes. See also Ledger 3. I didn't touch it. Not yet. I left the notebook where it was and closed the drawer quietly. My hands didn't shake, but my throat felt dry like paper. Ruben wasn't the kind of man to leave anything half done. He labeled his toolbox. He kept every key on its own ring with a date attached. If he had written something down about deposit boxes, about money, there had to be a reason. And if Paul knew, then he was acting fast, too fast. The sun had started its slow drop behind the hills, painting the living room in shades of orange and mauve. I sat down in his recliner instead of mine. It still smelled like cedar and the peppermint oil he used on his knees. I ran my hands along the armrest, feeling for something familiar. We never talked about death like some couples do. It wasn't fear. It was avoidance. He once said, "If you start talking about the end, it might hear you." I used to think that was foolish. Now I understood. The fire had gone low, so I added another log. The crackle filled the space like a heartbeat. Outside, I could see a few tire tracks on the snow-covered road. Probably the Hendersons or the postman. I hadn't checked the mailbox in 2 days. I forced myself to get up. The cold air bit through my cardigan as I stepped out onto the porch. Dead leaves rustled against the steps, caught in little snow drifts. The sky had turned that pale purple that only ever lasts 10 minutes. At the mailbox, there were 3 envelopes. One was a flyer from a pharmacy. One looked like a holiday catalog. The last one was from Constance. The envelope was thin, cream-colored, with handwriting that tried too hard to look effortless. I tore it open right there on the gravel path. It was a thank you card. No note, no warmth, just a printed message and her signature underneath. "Thank you for the arrangements. We'll be in touch. Constance, not we miss him. Not even hope you're okay. Just business." Cold and distant, like she was writing to a landlord. I looked back at the house. 48 years. Every crack in the wall, every dent in the floor. He made those. And she wanted to erase it like a chalk mark. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I wasn't hungry. Instead, I brewed another cup of cinnamon tea and sat at the kitchen table with my old grocery pad, the kind with a magnet on the back and faded cartoon peaches at the top. I started writing a list, not of food, but of questions. 1. Did Ruben tell Paul about the safety boxes? 2. Why Harrisburg? Who's the lawyer there? 3. Did 2019 mention me by name? 4. When was the last time I saw Paul alone? That last one stung. I couldn't remember. Not really. After Constance came into the picture, visits felt more like appointments. Timed, polite, shallow. She never liked how rustic the cabin was. always said, "You should get a granite counter. It'll increase the resale." As if she were the one who built the place. I flipped the pad over and started listing things Ruben had hidden. A $50 bill in the cookie tin, his father's dog tags under the toolbox, the bottle of bourbon in the laundry hamper that he never admitted to. He was a man of secrets, but they were never cruel. They were quiet secrets, the kind you tuck away to feel a little more in control. Now, it felt like someone was turning those secrets into leverage. I lit a candle on the mantel. He always said I burn them too quickly. "You're supposed to savor the scent, not rush it like a matchstick," he'd mutter. But tonight I needed that smell of sandalwood and smoke. It was the closest thing to his voice. I grabbed the Afghan and sat back in his chair. My joints complained, but I didn't care. I picked up an old envelope from the table. It had Ruben's writing on the back. Just one word. Callie, our granddaughter, 5 years old. Sweet as pie. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. I turned the envelope over. Inside, just a photograph. Callie and Ruben sitting on the dock, feet in the water, both looking at the horizon. It must have been taken last summer. Probably Paul's doing. A rare moment of stillness captured by accident. I ran my thumb over the photo. What would she remember of him? Would she remember how he used to make up bedtime stories about a bear who ran a bakery? Or how he let her stir pancake batter even when it made a mess? I couldn't let her lose those memories. I placed the photo on the nightstand beside my tea and reached for the black notebook again. I didn't open it, but I placed it next to my list. And in that moment, I realized something. I thought I buried him, but it felt like someone else was trying to bury me. "You always make too much, Mom," Constance said, not even looking at me. She slid the casserole dish aside with her perfectly manicured hands like it was a catalog she never ordered. My butternut squash, the same recipe Ruben had loved for years, sat untouched next to a glowing bowl of sweet potatoes with marshmallows, the kind bought frozen, reheated in a foil pan. Paul stood at the head of the table, carving the turkey like he was disassembling a fax machine. Efficient, silent. His hands moved quickly, but his eyes never lifted from the task. Ruben used to carve the turkey. He'd joke about the wishbone, about how every year it ended up in Constance's hand because she needed the extra luck. We used to laugh. Now, no one laughed. Just the scrape of utensils against ceramic plates and a murmured, "Pass the rolls," and I was seated at the far end of the table next to the neighbor's boy who had stopped by with a jar of cranberry jam and was now nose-deep in his phone. His mother chatted with Constance about real estate values in the area. "Prices are up 14% this year," she said proudly as if she were talking about her blood pressure. I forced a smile and took a sip of lukewarm cider. My plate was mostly empty. I hadn't had the appetite. Paul raised his glass halfway. "To my family," he mumbled. Constance echoed it, barely audible. The neighbor said it more enthusiastically. I lifted my glass, too, but my voice didn't come out. Across from me, Callie was watching. Not just looking, watching. Her eyes flicked from face to face, studying the silences. Her curls were tucked under a knit beanie, her phone face down beside her plate. She hadn't touched much of the food either, except the corn pudding. After dinner, the men disappeared to the den to watch the game, or pretend to. Constance collected plates with surgical precision. I tried to help but was told gently, No, we've got it. You just rest." That sounded polite, but the way she took the plate from my hand made it clear. I was in the way. I walked into the hallway, paused near the coat rack, then wandered toward the garden door. My eyes needed something green, something unlit by LEDs. Callie caught up to me. "Hey, Grandma, want some air?" I nodded. Her presence was the only warmth I'd felt since I arrived. We stepped outside. The porch light flickered. The wind carried the scent of pine needles and chimney smoke. She handed me a knit scarf from her coat pocket. "It's yours, remember? You left it last year." I wrapped it around my neck. "It still smells like cedar," I said. She smiled. "Your cabin always smells like that." "I love it." We sat on the bench near the garden. Most of the flowers had given up weeks ago, but a few stubborn marigolds clung to life near the fence. I watched her pull out her phone, not to scroll, but to open the camera app. "You're recording?" I asked. "Just audio," she whispered. "Listen." From the open kitchen window, voices spilled into the dark. "She brings that weird squash thing every year," Constance said, her voice sharp but playful. "I think it's her way of saying she still matters," Paul grunted. "Let her have it. Just don't let her drag her feet on the house stuff." "And what if she refuses?" There was a pause. "Then we push before the property taxes reset." I closed my eyes. This was my son. The same boy I had stayed up with during his ear infections. The one who used to run to the car window when I came home from work. Now he was measuring my grief in tax brackets. Callie touched my hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I wasn't even trying to catch that. I just had a feeling." "I know," I said quietly. "Me too." Inside, someone turned up the volume on the TV. Football announcers filled the house with artificial joy. We sat in silence a moment longer before she stood and offered her arm. "Come on, let me show you something upstairs. Dad never goes in the attic anymore." We walked quietly through the hallway. No one noticed. No one cared. Upstairs, the attic room was dustier than I remembered, but it still held a few pieces of Ruben's old furniture, an end table, a bookshelf filled with faded hardcovers, and in the corner, a small vinyl record player. Callie knelt beside it. "I found it last summer. Dad didn't even know it still worked." She pulled out a record in a cracked sleeve. He said, "This was your song." She set it on the turntable. The needle dropped, and then from those dusty old speakers came a melody I hadn't heard in 30 years. The first notes of that song hit me like a memory I wasn't ready for. Ruben used to hum it when he cooked, especially on Sundays after church when the house smelled like lemon polish and cinnamon toast. He'd grab my hand mid-stir, twirl me in the middle of the kitchen, apron and all. I sat down slowly in the old armchair by the window. The song kept playing. Callie didn't say a word, just sat cross-legged on the rug, looking at me like I was made of something worth studying. "Dad never told me anything," she finally said, "about how Grandpa got sick or why the wool stuff is weird." I didn't answer right away. The music faded into the gentle scratch of the vinyl. Then I said, "Your grandfather told me once, no matter what happens, I've written everything down." At the time, I thought he was talking about his war stories, his memoir. Callie raised an eyebrow. "But you're not sure now?" I shook my head. "Not anymore." Downstairs, I could hear the buzz of conversation again. Laughter, plates clinking, someone shouting at the TV. It sounded like a different world. "I don't think they see me anymore," I whispered. Callie nodded. "I see you." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notepad. Spiral-bound, pages curled from being shoved around too much. "I've been writing things down, too," she said. "Grandpa passed. Things I hear, things I notice." She handed it to me just in case. I flipped through a few pages, scribbled lines, phone calls she overheard, snippets of conversations between her parents late at night. One entry read, November 2nd. Dad took a call from a man named Jeffrey. Said something about pushing Mom before Q4 ends. I looked at her. "You understand what this could mean?" She nodded. "I do. That's why I'm keeping it safe." We stayed in that attic room for another hour. She showed me old books Ruben had underlined, maps he'd annotated. His handwriting was still so exact, even when his fingers had started to tremble. By the time we came down, the dining table was cleared. My casserole was still untouched, just a dent in the foil where someone had moved it aside. Paul was in the den, beer in hand, yelling at the screen. Constance was at the kitchen island rinsing wine glasses with a face that said she wished everyone would just leave already. Callie kissed me on the cheek and slipped away upstairs. I walked slowly to the window facing the backyard. The garden was mostly dead now, leaves brown and stiff, clinging to bushes that wouldn't bloom again till April, if at all. Paul's voice floated in from the den. "Mom is still here." "Just for a bit longer," Constance replied. "We'll drive her back in the morning." I turned to leave, but then I heard him add low and casual, "We really need to close that paperwork before the holidays, before she gets too, whatever." "Too what?" "Too forgetful. Too aware. Too inconvenient. I stood near the fireplace and watched the flames reflect in the glass cover. This house was warm, but the kind of warmth that didn't ask if you were cold. I felt something crack inside. Not anger, not yet. Just the first shift of old earth starting to slide. Callie came back downstairs just as I was gathering my coat. She slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. "Read it later," she whispered. "When you're alone." I gave her a small nod, the kind of nod women give each other when they're not allowed to say everything out loud. We drove back in silence the next morning. Paul kept the radio on talk news. Constance scrolled her phone. Nobody asked how I slept. Nobody asked if I was okay. When we pulled into the driveway of my cabin, I thanked them. Automatic, rehearsed. Constance didn't even take off her seatbelt. Paul handed me my overnight bag. "We'll call you next week about the notary. It's just easier if we handle that stuff soon." I said nothing. The air smelled different here. Cleaner, quieter, real. Inside, the fire had long gone out. I lit a match and started one again, then sat by the hearth with a blanket draped over my knees. Only then did I unfold Callie's note. It wasn't long, just one sentence. "I believe you're the only one who actually knows what Grandpa meant." She was right. And now I had to decide whether to open that drawer again. The one with the ledger, the one with the map of safety deposit boxes scattered across 3 towns. Each entry in Ruben's crisp hand. I watched my breath fog the window. My son's house was warm, but I had never felt colder. There's a kind of silence that only follows betrayal. The kind that makes old floorboards creak louder. It was nearly dusk when I lit the last lamp in the cabin. The pale light smeared itself across the windows, bouncing off dust that had lived on the panes longer than any of us. Outside, the wind picked up and the naked trees rattled like a warning. I stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, holding a cup of tea I'd already forgotten I poured. My eyes landed on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. It had been there since the day we moved into this house. I had packed it myself when we first got married, filled with things I thought were important. Wedding napkins, my mother's lace gloves, a yellowed handkerchief with my initials stitched in thread now too faded to make out. I hadn't opened it in decades, but Ruben's voice came back to me again, clear this time. "If you ever need proof, check the cedar chest." I set the tea down, let my knees creak as I knelt. The brass latch stuck for a moment, like it didn't want to remember, but then it gave. The smell hit me first, cedar and thyme. The inside was layered in fabric that had aged into softness. A few old holiday cards on top, then photo albums. My fingers traced over pictures of us in the early years. Ruben in his postal uniform, me in a sun hat too large for my head. Then I found the envelope, not sealed, but thick, heavy with something that demanded attention. Inside, I found documents, handwritten pages clipped with a small binder, a USB stick taped to the back of one sheet. My fingers trembled a little as I pulled out the paper beneath. A notarized will, dated June 2019. The name stared back at me. "I, Ruben L. Winters, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament. In the event of my death, I pass the house and assets to my granddaughter, Callie Winters." My breath caught. Not Paul, not Constance. Callie. I sat back against the bed frame, the weight of it pressing against my spine. Ruben had known, he had planned. My heart started to beat faster, not with fear, but something sharper. A strange clarity washed over me like cold water, splashed across the mind. He hadn't trusted them, and now neither did I. Among the pile of papers was a smaller envelope marked only with my name, my handwriting. Ruben must have made me write it once, maybe long ago, to remind me it was mine to open. Inside it was a small slip of paper with a code, probably for the USB. And under it all, folded so many times it nearly fell apart, was a printout of a scanned letter. It was a draft of the letter he'd once wanted to send to a lawyer friend, someone I vaguely remembered from our early years, a name not spoken in decades. I hadn't thought of that man since Ruben stopped delivering to his neighborhood. There was no anger inside me. Not yet, just a quiet unraveling of the truth. And alongside it, something else took root. Resolve. I reached across the chest and pulled out a small cloth. It was an old dish towel, checkered, worn thin at the corners. I wrapped the USB and the will inside it, careful not to crease anything. My hands moved with a steadiness that surprised me. Then I walked to the old rotary phone in the hallway, picked it up, and dialed a number I hadn't used in 20 years. It rang twice before someone picked up. A man's voice deepened by age, but still carrying that same crispness. "Hello." I hesitated, then spoke the name I hadn't said in decades. "Arthur, it's Sylvette." There was a pause. "Well," he said slowly, "I thought you died." "I didn't," I answered simply. "But I need your help. I think Ruben left me something to fight with, and I think my son is trying to take it away." He didn't respond right away. I could hear the hum of an old radiator in the background, a dog barking faintly in the distance. Then, "Are you still at Blue Ridge?" "Yes, I'll be there tomorrow afternoon." Click. I stood there a moment longer, holding the receiver like it could tether me to something solid. When I finally hung it up, the cabin had gone quiet again. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not betrayal, not grief, preparation. The next morning, frost clung to the windows like a second skin. I lit the fireplace before sunrise, needing more than heat. I needed something alive in this house again. I'd placed the wrapped USB and will in a shoebox inside my closet beneath some old scarves and a pair of boots that no longer fit. I didn't sleep much. I just sat in the rocker by the fireplace, mending a tear in my cardigan and listening to the old gospel station hum low in the background. I replayed Ruben's voice over and over in my mind. The man had been careful, deliberate, a planner always. This wasn't a whim. This was strategy. By mid-morning, I dusted off an old cassette player and slipped in the USB with the adapter Callie had shown me how to use months ago. Ruben had recorded a voice note. "No frills, no greetings. If they try to rewrite this, trust your gut. Give this to someone you trust. I couldn't stop them for you, but I made sure they won't get away with it if you don't let them."
He didn't sound scared.
He sounded certain. I sat back, eyes wet, but not weeping. My Ruben, who had never raised his voice at me, never forgotten a single anniversary, not even in our leanest years, had left me a map. It was only now that I understood what he meant by writing everything down. I opened the rest of the envelope and found a second slip. 3 addresses scribbled in his handwriting. One was a P.O. box in Harrisburg. Another looked like an old storage facility. The last was a lawyer's office, Arthur's, I realized. There was still so much I didn't know. Why hadn't Ruben told me more while he was alive? Or had he, and I simply wasn't listening? Later that day, Callie stopped by. She said it was to return my Tupperware, but I knew better. Her eyes searched my face the way only Ruben's used to. That girl didn't miss much. We sat at the tiny kitchen table while she picked at a cinnamon cookie, and I poured her peppermint tea. The fire cracked behind us and outside the cabin. The sky hung low and gray. I heard them talking again. She said, "Mom and Dad. Something about getting you to hurry up. I think they're scared." I nodded but said nothing. "I don't think it's about taxes," she added. "I think they want the house fast." I slid the dish towel bundle across the table. She raised her eyebrows. "Don't open it here," I said. "Just hold on to it. If something happens, you'll know what to do." She didn't ask questions, just tucked it into her oversized coat pocket and gave me the kind of look that passes between people who've already decided which side they're on. "I can set up a folder online," she said quietly. "Back up whatever's on that USB. Make sure it's safe." I nodded again. When she left, I stood on the porch, watching her walk back down the gravel path. The leaves had nearly all fallen, and her silhouette against the rust-colored earth looked like it had been drawn in charcoal. That evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, my fingers brushed against something hard tucked between Ruben's socks.
A key.
I held it up to the light. Small, old brass, no tag. I had to guess where it belonged. I opened the closet, pulled down the tin Ruben used to keep his old stamp albums in, and under it found the small lockbox we hadn't used since the early 2000s. The key slid in like it had never left. Inside were letters, dozens, some unopened, some addressed to me, some never sent. Letters between Reuben and Arthur, legal discussions, notes about Paul and Constance. Most of them dated within the last 5 years. My heart hurt reading them, not because of what they said, but because I had never known the extent of Reuben's quiet worry. He had shielded me from so much, and now he is gone. But the map he left behind, his will, the USB, the names and notes, all of it had shifted something inside me. I was no longer the woman who wept quietly in her rocker while the world closed around her. I had work to do. I spent the next hour organizing everything into folders, legal documents in one, personal letters in another. I labeled them carefully in block letters the way Reuben used to. There was dignity in order. The sun dipped beneath the tree, casting long shadows across the floor. The radio played a hymn I hadn't heard in years. I turned it off. Then I stood still for a moment, hearing nothing but the wind pressing against the cabin walls. It wasn't peaceful. Not yet. But it was mine. I took the USB and the will, wrapped them in an old dish towel, and called someone I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. I hadn't seen Diane in over 2 decades. But when she stepped off that bus with her leather briefcase, I knew Reuben had planned this. She hadn't changed much. Her hair had thinned and her coat looked heavier, but her stride, straight, no nonsense, was the same. She didn't pause or scan the station like someone looking for directions. She walked right toward me, as if we just had coffee last week. When she hugged me, I held on longer than I meant to.
We didn't talk much during the drive.
I had left the cabin warm, left cinnamon tea steeping on the counter, like I'd always done when Reuben had guests. Diane didn't ask about the town. She only looked out the window, saying once, "It's smaller than I remember." And that was it. The diner smelled like overbrewed peppermint syrup. Christmas lights blinked unevenly in the windows, and someone had placed a plastic Santa near the pie display. We slid into a booth in the far corner, the same one we used to sit in back when our kids were still in braces, and we thought PTA meetings were the biggest battles we'd face. Mrs. Eunice waddled over with a smile, so wide I thought her face might crack. "Well, I'll be," she said, eyes darting between us. "If it isn't the silent half of Blue Ridge Glen and her long-lost sister in arms." I tried to smile. Diane didn't. 2 coffees. I know better than to ask what kind. Eunice bustled off, apron strings bouncing behind her. Diane leaned her briefcase against the wall and opened her coat slowly, her eyes locked on mine. "Show me what you found." I slid the envelope across the table, slow and steady. The USB, the will, the notarized stamp. She opened it with gloved hands, laid everything out like a surgeon prepping for a delicate procedure. As she read, her brow furrowed. "This is airtight," she muttered. 209, notarized, signed, naming Callie as heir. That alone supersedes anything else, unless they've got something more recent and legal, which I doubt. She looked up at me then, and I saw something sharp in her eyes. Reuben was smarter than we gave him credit for. I sipped my coffee. It was bitter and too hot, but I didn't flinch. "He always trusted you," I said quietly. "Said you had a steel backbone, just like I used to." She gave a short laugh. "Well, we both got bent for a while, but looks like it's time to unbend." Mrs. Eunice brought over 2 slices of cherry pie, without asking. "I just know y'all need this," she said, setting them down with a wink. Then she leaned in a little closer. "Folks have been whispering about Paul. Said he's been asking questions about the property office, looking into transfer timelines. Not my business, of course. But Blue Ridge Glen's a whisper town." When she walked away, Diane tapped her fork against the plate and said, "They're moving fast. Too fast. That's good. Rushed people make mistakes." I nodded. "So what do we do?" She folded the will again, slid it back into the envelope. "We make copies. We prepare. We meet Halpern and have him recertify this if needed." And then she paused. "We wait." The word didn't sit well with me. I'd been waiting too long already. First for grief to settle, then for Paul to speak the truth. Now for some silent storm to break open. But Diane looked calm, collected. Her briefcase stayed closed, but I knew it held power. We talked through scenarios. What if Paul contested? What if Constance forged? What if they pressured Callie? Diane had answers. She'd seen things in her line of work. Wills accidentally lost. Heirs manipulated. Signatures coached. She had countermeasures for all of them. You'll need to play along just a little longer, she said, finishing the last bite of her pie, until they show their hand. I drove Diane back to the cabin just as the sun began to set behind the bare trees, casting long gray shadows over the winding road. The frost on the windshield was already creeping in from the corners. Inside the house, I lit the fireplace and poured 2 mugs of tea, the same cinnamon blend Ruben used to tease me for overbrewing. Diane walked slowly around the living room, running her hand along the mantel. He kept it just like I remember, she said. Even that crooked clock. He never liked changing things, I replied. Said time shouldn't be fixed if people aren't. She chuckled at that, but there was a wistfulness in her face. Then she turned, leaned against the wall, and looked at me seriously. Still, you sure you're ready for this? It's not going to be a clean fight. Families rarely are. I thought I was ready when I buried him, I said, eyes fixed on the fire. But it turns out grieving Ruben was easier than watching Paul become a stranger. She didn't answer right away, then quietly said, they'll test you, doubt you, twist your words. You can't afford to get emotional. I looked at her. I've been told to stay calm most of my life. I'm not calm anymore. That night, while Diane slept in the guest room, an old quilt pulled up to her chin, the soft whir of the heater nearby, I sat at the kitchen table with Ruben's ledger. I traced the handwriting on the margins, the firm strokes of a man who believed in order. There were addresses I hadn't noticed before, names I barely remembered. And next to one entry dated February 2019, final draft notarized. Backup delivered to DH. DH, Diane Hughes. I let the weight of that settle over me. He had trusted her before he trusted our son. He had sent the backup to her before his own lawyer saw it. Somehow, he had anticipated the breach. Maybe not the method, but the intent and that trust. It was coming back to me in the form of briefcases and pie and long conversations over coffee that tasted like burned hope. The next morning, we drove into town again. Mr. Halpern's office was 2 blocks from the post office, above the dry cleaner, with a view of the snowy main street and the church steeple. He was thinner than I remembered, paler, too, with thick glasses and fingers that trembled when he opened the door. Mrs. Winters, he said, glancing at Diane. And Hughes, she said, offering her hand. I used to work for a firm in Harrisburg. Ah, he said, but didn't press. We sat, and I handed him the envelope. He read in silence, adjusted his glasses twice, tapped the paper with a practiced motion. This is solid, he finally said. Supersedes anything and signed or later. If someone's trying to override this, they're walking on thin ice. Would you be willing to testify to that? Diane asked, and he paused, looked between us. I would, but I'd rather avoid court. Best if we corner them legally before they know they've been cornered.
He leaned in.
Who else has this copy? Just us, I said. Good, he said. Keep it that way for now. We stepped back into the cold with a signed affidavit in Diane's bag and a shared silence hanging between us. Not tense, just heavy, like we were both carrying something that hadn't yet decided if it was a burden or a shield. Diane squeezed my arm as we got into the car. Next move's theirs, she said. We just need to be patient. I've been patient my whole life, I replied, brushing snow off the windshield. But now I'm something else. That evening, I sat alone in my room while Diane took a call from her daughter in the other room. I turned on the old record player Callie had helped set up during one of her visits. It groaned for a second, then spun into a soft gospel tune that Ruben had loved. I took the dish towel again, unwrapped the USB, and placed it into a small box with the will. Then I wrote a note. If anything happens to me, give this to Callie. She deserves to know who Ruben really was. I slid the box under the bed next to the cedar chest. Then I turned off the light. Outside, the wind was rising. And then Diane said, You'll need to play along just a little longer until they show their hand. They thought they were ambushing me, but they were walking straight into the script Ruben left behind. The invitation came by text. No warmth, no preamble, Just a line from Paul. We'd like to discuss some paperwork. Come over Sunday at 4. I didn't reply right away. I made a pot of peppermint tea, pulled on Ruben's old flannel shirt, and stood at the window. The snow had softened everything outside, but the cold still crept into the bones of this house. I lit the fire anyway, not for heat, but for memory. Play along a little longer, Diane had said. And so I did. When Sunday came, I dressed with care. I wore the pearl earrings Ruben gave me on our 40th anniversary, and the deep navy sweater Callie once said made me look like a librarian in an old spy movie. It was too much for a casual afternoon, but then again, nothing about this meeting was casual. Paul opened the door like a man welcoming a delivery, not a mother. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping aside. Constance hovered in the hallway, arms crossed, lips pressed into that familiar line of forced hospitality. "Come in, tea's ready." Their living room was staged like a showroom. Fireplace flickering, coffee table polished to a mirror shine, couch cushions plumped with unnatural precision. They'd even set out a plate of ginger snaps. Store-bought, I noted. The sugar coating didn't fool me. Callie sat at the far end of the sectional, earbuds in, pretending not to watch. Her eyes met mine for just a second. Enough. Paul cleared his throat. Let's get to it. We've been looking over some of Dad's estate documents. I nodded, setting my purse on the floor, but keeping it close. Constance stepped in, and we found something unexpected. A draft from 2021. Ruben updated his wishes. Updated. I repeated, keeping my voice level. After he was diagnosed, Paul shifted uncomfortably. It's just a clarification, really. We thought it would be best to bring it to you first, out of respect. That word, respect, landed like a wet sock. He pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table toward me. A moment passed before I opened it. Inside was a single page printed cleanly with what looked like Ruben's signature scrolled at the bottom. But I'd been married to that hand for nearly 50 years. This wasn't his penmanship. It was a performance, a forgery in its Sunday best. I see, I said, setting the paper back down without touching it again. And what exactly does this change? Well, Constance jumped in too quickly. It simplifies things, transfers the property to Paul directly, streamlines the process for everyone. For everyone, I echoed. My tea sat cooling on the coaster. I didn't reach for it. The fireplace popped behind us, the only sound in the room for a long while. I let silence stretch until they grew uneasy with it. I'll need to review it, I said finally. I don't make decisions on the spot. Constance looked as if she had more to say, but Paul raised a hand. Of course, take your time. I stood slowly. I assume you'll send a copy? Paul blinked. You don't want to keep that one?
No.
I don't like holding on to things that don't belong to me. As I turned toward the hallway, Callie stood up. I'll walk Grandma out. We stepped into the cold. The porch light flickered, as if unsure it should stay on. I breathed in deep, letting the air cut through the tension in my chest. Grandma, Callie whispered, slipping her phone into her jacket pocket. That signature didn't even look like Grandpa's. I checked some of his old Christmas cards. It's different. My hand closed gently over hers. You saw that too? She nodded. And Mom said something last week. Something about getting it over with before the year ends. That's when I knew Diane had been right. It was already happening, and I had to act now. We lingered on the porch a little longer, pretending to admire the neighbors' holiday lights. Inside my purse was the flash drive with Ruben's voice, the 2019 notarized will, a handwritten letter I had poured myself into last night, wrinkled, smudged with the edge of a teacup, and signed with the kind of clarity that comes only after years of being overlooked. That night, I sat at my desk by the window and carefully packed a padded envelope. To Mr. Halperin, in the event they forget who I am. I walked it to the mailbox myself, feeling the frostbite at my fingertips. The flag went up with a soft click. And just like that, the next move was no longer theirs. Callie and I didn't speak much on the way back. Her gaze drifted to the car window, fogging slightly with her breath, while I kept both hands on the wheel, feeling the slight tremble in my fingers. Not fear, no, not anymore, but the anticipation of putting something long buried into motion. At home, I made us both hot cocoa. She sat at the kitchen table, fiddling with the corner of a paper napkin. Her brows were furrowed, lips pressed thin. A look far too serious for a 17-year-old on a Saturday night. "You said you needed my help," she finally said. "What do you want me to do?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over to the drawer beneath the telephone nook and took out the small envelope Diane had helped me prepare. Inside were three things: a copy of Ruben's 2019 notarized will, a printed transcript of his voice note, and the USB itself. "I need you to walk this to the mailbox on the corner," I said, placing the envelope in her hand. "It's going to Mr. Halpern. Do you remember him?" She nodded slowly. "The man with the gold tie clip, who used to bring you donuts." "That's the one." Callie looked at the envelope like it was fragile glass. "What happens after he gets this?" "I don't know yet," I said truthfully. "But I trust Ruben's timing and Diane's instinct." We were silent again, the only sound being the small ticking of the wall clock. I found myself staring at Ruben's old flannel jacket hanging by the door. His scent was mostly gone, but sometimes when the wind blew through just right, I could almost hear his laugh echoing off the wood beams. Callie stood up and buttoned her coat. "I'll be right back." I watched her walk down the driveway from the window, her boots leaving faint prints in the light dusting of snow. She looked like her grandfather, shoulders set back, steady stride, stronger than she probably knew. I turned back toward the kitchen table and sat down. On impulse, I reached for the pad and pen by the landline and began to write. "To whom it may concern. If you're reading this, it means someone has tried to erase me. This is not a plea. It's a record, a memory, a name." I wrote until the cocoa had long since gone cold. That night, I wrapped the USB, the voice transcript, and the copy of the will into a second package. This one, I addressed carefully in my steadiest hand: Mr. Harvey Halpern, Esquire, estate of Reuben Winters. In the event they forget who I am, I wrote the last line on a card, folded it once, and tucked it inside. The next morning, I drove the package to the post office myself. I requested certified delivery, signature required. The woman behind the counter was young, polite, and uninterested. I didn't mind. There was a comfort in the transaction being boring. "Want a receipt?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Keep the tracking number printed clearly." Back home, I sat by the window with a blanket around my legs and a crossword puzzle in my lap, but I didn't fill in a single square. I kept glancing at the old clock above the fireplace, counting minutes I couldn't control. Around 3 p.m., the phone rang. Diane's voice crackled through, brisk as always. "He'll have it by Tuesday. In the meantime, act like nothing's changed." "I can do that," I replied. "Good," she said. "And Sylvette?" "Yes. I'm proud of you." I didn't expect the warmth that surged up behind my eyes. I blinked quickly and focused on a spot across the room. "Thank you," I managed. The following days passed in slow motion. I did the things I always did: sorted laundry, peeled carrots, wiped down the windowsills, but everything felt sharper, like a picture coming into focus. Then on Thursday evening, Paul called. "Mom, we need to finalize a few things. Can you come over Saturday morning? Just some paperwork. Won't take long." I agreed calmly. Inside, my stomach turned. I called Diane after I hung up. "It's happening." "They're going to present it," she said. "Stay quiet. Don't agree to anything. And don't let them see even a flicker of victory in your eyes." "Understood. And remember what Ruben told you. Trust your gut." That night before bed, I reread Ruben's handwriting on the will. His signature was crisp, unmistakable. Below it, the notarization stamp shimmered faintly under the lamplight. His voice still echoed in my ears. "If they try to rewrite this, trust your gut." I folded the documents once more, placed them in the dish towel again, and tucked them inside my handbag. I slept without dreams. The morning the letter arrived from Mr. Halpern's office, I was folding linens like nothing had changed. But everything had. The old flannel sheet still smelled like cedar and the faint cologne Reuben used to wear, the kind that clung to his wool coats and his collarbone for days. I stood there by the laundry basket, smoothing the creases out of pillowcases, letting the silence stretch. Not the kind of silence that punishes, but the kind that hums like closure. I hadn't told Callie yet. I hadn't told anyone. When I opened the envelope, I already knew what it would say. Still, my hands trembled. The letter was neatly typed on cream stationery, signed in black ink. Per the 2019 notarized document submitted by Mrs. Sylvette Winters and confirmed by our office, the estate shall be executed in accordance with the will of Mr. Reuben Winters, dated July 5, 2019. All property and assets are to be passed to Miss Callie Winters. Any conflicting claims will be dismissed upon review.
Dismissed.
Just like that, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The kettle hissed behind me, but I didn't get up. The silence was no longer cruel. It was sacred. Reuben had kept his word. He'd written everything down. He'd prepared for the moment they might try to erase me or rewrite what we had built together. He had known.
Somehow he always did.
That afternoon, I called Callie. She arrived in her beat-up sedan, still wearing her school sweatshirt and jeans dusted with grass from track practice. She looked so much like her father used to back when he was kind, before everything became spreadsheets and property lines. But her eyes were different. Hers were still soft. I handed her the copy of the letter. She read it once, then again. "You mean Grandpa really left everything to me?" I nodded. "He trusted you. He saw who you were." She was quiet for a moment, running her fingers along the edge of the page. "Mom said it was just rumors," she whispered. "That you were confused. That Grandpa was too old to make decisions. She said those things because she needed you to believe them," I said gently. But Reuben was never confused. He saw clearer than most. Callie looked up at me, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you fight them sooner?" I smiled. "Because sometimes fighting too early lets them change the battlefield."
Reuben taught me that. So did Diane.
"Diane?" Her eyes widened. I nodded. "An old friend. The kind of friend you don't realize you need until it's almost too late." Callie hugged me tight and fast. No drama, just warmth. It reminded me of when she was small, when she used to climb into my lap with picture books and ask me to read until we both fell asleep on the couch. "You're not alone, Grandma," she whispered. "I know," I said. And this time I truly believed it. That evening, I dressed in Reuben's favorite cardigan, the one with the suede elbows, and walked down to Mr. Halpern's office. The snow had started again, lightly dusting the sidewalks. Christmas lights blinked in the windows of old shops. I passed by a bakery that smelled of cinnamon and orange zest. Somewhere in the distance, someone was tuning a violin. Halpern's office hadn't changed since 1992. The same brass nameplate, the same green banker's lamp. He offered me tea and spoke with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had seen families rise and fall over inheritance disputes. "Everything's in order," he said. "You've protected your granddaughter's future, Mrs. Winters." "No," I said. "Reuben did. I just followed the trail he left." Halpern nodded. "Still, it takes grit to stay quiet that long." "It wasn't silence," I said, smiling faintly. "It was strategy." Before I left, he handed me an envelope. "One last thing from Reuben. Found it taped to the bottom of the file cabinet drawer," he said. "Said to give it to you only after the dust settled." I didn't open it until I was back in the cabin. It was just a small note folded once, written in his old blocky handwriting. "You were never just someone's mother. You were always the cornerstone." I folded the note and slipped it into the pocket of Reuben's old coat, hanging by the door. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was carrying weight. I felt like I was carrying him. The snow deepened overnight. By morning, everything was blanketed in soft white. The trees, the mailbox, even the steps that creaked beneath my boots. I stepped outside with my cinnamon tea in hand and looked across the street at Paul's house. There were no cars in the driveway, no lights in the window, just a wreath on the front door, perfectly centered, untouched by wind or time. I didn't knock. There was nothing left to say. Constance had received the legal notice 2 days prior, forwarded through her firm. I imagine the look on her face when she read the signature, notarized and authenticated, not forged, not fake, real, like the life she tried to rewrite and claim wasn't hers to hold. And Paul. Well, I hoped he'd come around one day, but I wasn't waiting anymore. Back inside, I pulled out the good china, the blue set with the gold rim we only used on Christmases when Reuben carved the roast, and the children still sang carols out loud. I lit the little pine-scented candle he gave me 2 years ago and set out 3 plates, one for me, one for her, and one for Reuben, his photo at least. Callie arrived just before dusk, her cheeks red from the cold and her eyes sparkling in the low amber light of the living room. "You did all this?" she said, stepping in and unwrapping her scarf. "I had help," I said. "Reuben's recipe cards still know what they're doing." She laughed, and it echoed gently against the walls. Then she set down a small package. "Before I forget, this is for you." I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a wooden frame with a handwritten quote in ink. "Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the seed of your strength." I couldn't speak. I just nodded. Later, after dinner, we sat by the fireplace with the old vinyls playing. Ella Fitzgerald, then Johnny Mathis, then the Andrews Sisters, the crackle of the record, the hiss of the fire, the quiet between us.
It all felt exactly right.
"You know," Callie said, turning toward me, "I never thought I'd want to live in a small town, but this place, it's honest, even when it's hard." "It's yours now," I said. "Not just the house, the stories, the history, the decisions." She bit her lip, eyes glistening. "I'll take care of it. I promise."
"I know you will," I said.
"But don't do it for me or for him. Do it because you know what matters. That's all we ever tried to teach you." She nodded. "And Mom." I exhaled. Some people spend their whole lives chasing more, but more isn't peace. It's noise. Let her have it. We stood by the window after she left. I watched her drive off into the white dusk, taillights blinking down the snowy road. The wind had quieted. The night was still.
Somewhere a dog barked.
Somewhere else, a wind chime sang. And then I did something I hadn't done in over 10 years. I turned the key in the front door lock and unlocked it just like that. No fear, no waiting, just a woman in her home, in her skin, in her truth. And for the first time in years, I slept with the door unlocked. Some evenings are so quiet, you'd almost believe things were always this peaceful. But those who've ever felt lonely in their own home know true peace is when your spirit no longer feels pushed aside. I used to think love meant sacrifice without limits. But I've come to understand this. If you don't value yourself, even those closest to you might forget to. Kindness isn't always returned, but self-respect should never be surrendered. If this story made you think of a quiet mother or a grandmother who once gave everything, maybe today's the day to reach out. A phone call, a thank you, a small reminder. I see you. Because sometimes all they've ever needed is to feel seen.